Hello and welcome to Pictorial Planet. My name's John Finch. Today's video is my second Q&A video. A few weeks ago I did Q&A part 1 where I covered roughly the first half of the videos that I've put up on YouTube. And this video is a catch-up to do the second half of the video Q&A. And what I've done is I've gone through the videos from 1 to Ansel Adams in your developing tank up until the present D76 series, and picked out some questions that I thought would be interesting to a majority of our audience, and I want to answer them for you because I know you can't all be going through all the comments and all the questions to have a look at what people are asking. And you all ask such good questions, so don't stop asking questions. It's great and I love that. And the advantage, of course, is that I can do these Q&As and spread that knowledge out to everybody else. So very useful. Keep asking those questions. So just as the first Q&A video I did a few weeks ago, I'll use the first name of the person's handle if I can pronounce it. And forgive me if I get it wrong. And I'll read the question out and then we'll talk about my answer to that question. So, want Ansel Adams in your developing tank? That's the first video I'm going to start covering. And this was about Barry Thornton's 2-bath. I'd done a video a couple before this one about Barry Thornton 2-bath, unknown film, unknown time in developer or something like that. And it was about using a 2-bath developer for a film that you have no clue for the development time, or you might not even know what the film is. I then covered the Barry Thornton 2-bath in this specific video of how to make it. And so the first person's name I can't pronounce, I'm afraid. It's Eastern European and I can't even read it. However, the question's really good. And the person asks, about Barry Thornton 2-bath, what agitation method do you use with this developer? So, 2-bath developers. In the first bath, you have a weak, or we could say a divided developer part A. And in the second bath, we have an accelerator, and that's how the two work. We'll talk a little more about them shortly. But agitation. So agitation with Barry Thornton 2-bath, as well as other 2-baths that I might use, is I put in bath A. Never pre-soak the film with a 2-bath developer. You need the film to be dry when it goes in to that first bath A. So I agitate for the first 30 seconds with bath A, and then I agitate for 5 seconds every 30 seconds. And this is what we call Kodak agitation. And that continues for the time the developer is in bath A. I then empty out bath A and pour in bath B. There's no wash in between. And in bath B, I now agitate for 5 seconds, just 2 inversions. And then I wait a minute, and then 2 more inversions, and then I wait a minute. Now, if you think about this, bath A is about soaking the developer really well into the emulsion. But there's also some development going on in bath A. Many of these 2-bath developers have a proper developer in bath A, similar to D23. Barry Thornton's 2-bath A is similar to D23. So it actually is developing in there. So we need to agitate it a little to stop any kind of bromide drag. Bath B is all about compensating for highlights and acutance. And so we don't want to move the bath B around much over the emulsion. We want to leave it in situ for a reasonable length of time between agitations. And that's why bath B has a slower agitation cycle of once a minute. So that is how I agitate in 2-bath developers. So the second question for the same video, Robert asked, what would be the shelf life of the raw chemicals for this developer? Now, Barry Thornton's 2-bath developer uses metol and sodium sulfite in bath A, and it uses sodium metaborate or Kodalk in bath B. The shelf life for these Raw chemicals is a long time. I've had metal that's been years old and it's worked fine. As long as you keep your raw chemicals in a tightly stoppered bottle, away from any chance of light getting, because light is energy. And if light hits the chemical, the energy that's imparting into the chemical can speed up deterioration. So keep them in a dark place and keep them in a tightly stoppered bottle so there's no oxygen or other gases getting into it that might react with that chemical. The only chemical which I think degrades very quickly is glycine, in my experience. And glycine does go off quite quickly, and anything over a year old is too old to use. And I have to purchase more glycine. And if you're looking to purchase glycine, there's a part of my website where I describe the suppliers where I get my chemicals from, and you'll be able to see where I get my glycine from there. Roland asked in the same video, can I substitute the sodium metaborate in part B with borax, sodium sulfite, in the same ratio as a D23 replenisher? Not quite sure what you mean about the replenisher. However, talking about two bath developers, in Barry Thornton's we have the sodium metaborate is part B. You can use borax in place of that. And I would use a 1% solution of borax. That's 10 grams in a litre of water. And it will give a finer grain and probably a little more compensation. But it still will be a good negative. Borax has been used a lot as a part B. Now, let's just go back a second. Let's just back up. Two bath developers. Yes, there are those developers that are made specifically for two baths. But there's also a way of using two bath development where you use a regular developer, any developer you want, except maybe a pyro developer, as part A, and you develop for roughly 2/3 of the time in that developer, and then you pour it out and you pour in a 1% borax solution. And then you go to agitation once a minute, like we described earlier. And this is a sort of two bath development system. Ansel Adams used this system, and it will compensate well with the negatives and it will finish off the development. It's a really good idea. So if you're using HC110 or if you're using D76, any of those kind of developers, try 2/3 of the development time in that developer as normal development. Just develop it normally, and then at the 2/3 time point, pour it out and pour in a 1% borax solution at the same temperature, 20 centigrade, and agitate for 5 seconds, and then each minute for 5 seconds, and give it 3 minutes, 4 minutes in that part B. Pour it out, stop and fix, and you'll get beautiful negatives. It's been used a lot, so that's a good idea if you've got some high contrast scenes on your roll. You've been out, bright sunshine, snow, whatever, high contrast. Try that technique. It works. It's very effective. Sodium carbonate I've written down too. Sodium carbonate can be used as a bath B, a 1% solution again. You'll get larger grain, maybe more contrast because it's more alkali, but it will also work. Sodium carbonate. So, John asked, in the John Charles Woods book, the Zone System Craft book, which I don't have by the way, page 86, Kodak D23, he says that the first bath sets the contrast, and it's the first bath that he suggests increases and reduces times, for instance N-1, N-2, etc. Why do you use different times for different films? So there's really two things going on there. So the first thing, yes, it does. So like I said earlier, bath A in many two bath developers is a real developer and is actually developing the film. The longer you leave it in bath A and agitate every 30 seconds, the more you're going to develop that film. When you then switch to bath B, it's already at a heightened amount of contrast from the longer development in bath A, and bath B will finish it off, and it will end up at a higher contrast level than if you just did your standard 4 minutes plus 4 minutes, or HP5, 5 minutes plus 5 minutes. So you can improve the contrast by developing longer in bath A. So that's very interesting. If you're not getting contrast, if you feel when you're using a 2 bath that your prints are muddy, that you're not getting the zing that you want in your negatives, try adding time to bath A. Add a minute, add 2 minutes, see what happens. I think you will find your contrast will increase. This is a way of doing N plus and N minus development. You'll have to do the work, you'll have to do the homework of working out how to get that N plus 1, N plus 2, and so on, but it's possible with a 2 bath developer. Barry Thornton, by the way, is, to answer the second part of this question, Barry Thornton is the one who suggested the timings for bath A's and B's for different films. So he was the one who suggested 4 minutes and 4 minutes for slow films, 5 minutes plus 5 minutes for fast films, and that's where that comes from. Steph asked in the same video, is it possible to mix only around 300 ml of bath A and B? I'd rather mix new more often than use the 1 litre over a long period of time. Okay, so yes, it is possible. You could mix just your 300 ml of A and 300 and use them and throw them away. I wouldn't reuse them at such a small amount, 300 ml. I wouldn't reuse that. But there's something you're missing if you do that. And we've talked about this in earlier videos, so some of you will probably be thinking along these lines already as I'm answering this question. With Barry Thornton 2 bath, you have 1 litre of A and 1 litre of bath B. As you reuse this developer, and you can use it up to 15 films, as you reuse it, you're building up the byproducts in bath A. And these byproducts are useful because they're going to lower the amount of grain and they're going to sharpen the negative. These are the bromide byproducts. So you're encouraged to reuse this developer. It's actually an improvement to reuse this developer. It's like replenishing without having to replenish. Except you can only do 15 films and then you have to remake the bath A and B. But that's what you'd be missing out if you made just the 300 ml for that one development session and threw it away. So it's up to you, but I don't recommend it. I recommend make the full amount. It lasts for at least 6 months and just use it whenever you need to develop a film. So moving on to the next video that I want to answer questions on, the easy way to load 120 film into a Patterson tank. I got a lot of comments on this video, and I think it's possibly the most popular video on my YouTube channel actually. People were really into this easy ways to load the 120 film. And in fact, I'm going to show you something that somebody suggested, which works really well too, which I wanted to share with you. But first thing, Keith, he says, it seems that you have omitted to say that you have removed the small ball bearings from your reel ratchet mechanism. Unless you remove the ball bearings, you cannot pull the bit guide film out. Well, Keith, you're absolutely right. I did omit to say that, and I should have said that. I've got it on my website, but it's important that I should repeat it. Whenever I get a reel, I remove the ball bearings from the reel. Now, here's a reel I want to show you here. And if you look in this area where my finger is behind something, you can see the ball bearing is missing. I pop them out, and I pop them out because they just get in the way of loading the reel. They jam up, they get dirty, they don't let the film move smoothly back and forth. So yes, I should have told you guys that. I do take these ball bearings out of all of my reels. Thanks for that, Keith. Bob says, I slip a strip of fiber paper through the sides of the reel where the spiral entrance is, so it sticks out on either side. So I looked at that and I said, you know, that's a really good idea. So here we have a reel, and I want to load my film. Here's the loading parts here. If I can do this kind of backwards. And he gets a piece of paper like this, and he pops it underneath through the reel sides here. I think this is what he's saying. So that now you've got this way of putting your new film in and pushing it and finding those loading channels. So it easily slips into the load channels. You can push it on, especially when the ball bearings are removed. Push it on and boom, and then just pull that out. Brilliant. I wanted to show you all that. I think that's a great idea. This is the joy of having a channel like this. I really like this, is we can share these experiences and all learn from each other. I've been in the darkroom since I was 8 years old, and I'm still learning. I'm still learning so much. Never stop learning. You never know it all. It's great to be part of this community. So thank you very much. That's great, Bob. Bernard says, I use plastic kitchen gloves, really cheap when I'm handling film, especially in a dark bag. There's no sweat. Well, that's brilliant. I had never thought of that. Whenever I've used one of these bags, these blackout bags, these darkroom bag things that you can use out in the field, and I get inside of it and I get it all on and I start trying to get my film on a reel or something, it all gets a bit sticky and my sweat starts making everything a bit damp and the reel jams, and it just gets so frustrating. So I've always said to people, don't do that. Go into a room, make sure it's dark, and then do it all on a bench where you're not under any kind of stress, there's no sweat, and it's all dry and everything just runs smoothly. And of course that's true, but that tip is a great tip. I never thought of putting gloves on. That would have stopped things getting so sweaty. So, and again, Bernard, thank you very much. This is great stuff. The next video, making rapid fix, Agfa 304. Now this was, I'd done a TF2 video on alkaline fix, but TF2 is not very good for modern emulsion films like Delta and T-Max, these tabular grain technology films, because they have a lot of silver iodide in those films, and silver iodide is notoriously difficult to fix. So you need a powerful and fast fixer to actually fix that kind of film. So TF2, which is an old-fashioned sodium thiosulfate fixer, is not a very good fix for those. It will fix them, but it will take a long time, and it'll have to be relatively fresh and so on. But with Agfa 304, we add ammonium chloride into the chemistry, and there's a chemical reaction there, and ammonium thiosulfate comes out of the other end of that chemical reaction. So it becomes a fast fixer and is much more suitable to these tabular grain films. So Larry said, I've been making my own developers for a while now. If I want to make my own fixers as well, one question: is this solution used as stock or is it diluted? Well, that Agfa 304 video formula that I show you is full strength. You don't dilute that, you just use it as is. SD said, you said you would use this with pyro developers. Will it keep stain, or would TF3 be a better choice for pyro and Delta or T-Max? No, Agfa 304 is an alkaline fix and it's a rapid fix. So it will be absolutely safe with staining developers, perfectly safe. It will keep the stain and it will work well with tabular grain films. Negative Development asked a question: how many rolls of film will this fix? Well, Agfa 304, as the formula that I showed you how to make, used at full strength, should fix 10 to 20 films, and 30 10x8 papers. So you can use it for paper or you can use it for film. By the way, never use it for both. Keep your fix separate for paper than for films, because films have different byproducts than paper and they will mess up your paper. So don't mix the two up. And there's an article on my website about that. 10 or 20 films. Why 10 or 20? Well, that's because if you're using a tabular grain film, it is much harder on the developer than an old-fashioned type of film. So if I'm using Delta type films, for instance, Ilford Delta, I'll get 10, roughly 10 films fixed from that liter. But if I'm using Ilford FP4, which is an old-fashioned type of film, I'll get 20. So that's why there's two differences there. The next video I want to talk about is one question on quick stop bath, sodium metabisulfite. Sodium metabisulfite, I use that in my wine making. It's a very useful chemical. Peter asked, nothing to do with wine, he asked, have you ever used citric acid as a stop bath? Yes, I have, Peter, and it's a very good soft stop bath. One of the reasons it's so good is because it's very safe. For those of you out there who really want safety, who are sticking with your phenidone vitamin C developers, both for film and for paper, very safe. If you're sticking with stop bath, you go for citric acid. It's the safest of the stop baths. The next video, camera light metering part 1. Now part 1 was about incident light meters. And if you remember, we talked about, in fact, I've got a light meter here. We talked about we go to our subject and we point it back towards the camera from our subject and we take a reading through this dome, and it's an incident light meter reading. Christopher said, I should be using the incident mode for portraits and people and the reflected mode when, say, taking landscapes or subjects a long way from me. And it's a question mark. Well, incident meters are really good for portraits, no doubt about it. Because if you tried to do a spot meter reading on a person's face, for instance, you don't know what color, what shade of grey that color of their skin is. Now, I know that my hand, when I take a meter reading of my hand, it's zone 6. I know my hand is zone 6 because I've tested it. And I use this when I'm out and about. If I'm not sure about meter reading of a certain scene, I actually take a reading of my hand in the same light and know that that's a zone 6 meter reading I've just taken. It's like carrying around my own grey card. But everybody's different, all of us. So we don't know necessarily when we're doing a portrait what grey tone our skin colour is. So yes, incident meter readings, you go up to the person's face and usually you would go just under the chin and take a meter reading there, pointing towards the camera. That's an incident metering, and that'll be very accurate, because an incident meter reading is basically an 18% grey meter reading of that scene. That's what that dome is doing. It's giving you an 18% grey meter reading. It doesn't take colour, shade, anything into account. Just how much light is falling on that dome. And it thinks it's 18% grey. He talks about should I be doing a reflected mode reading or maybe a spot meter reading for landscapes if the subject is a long way away from me. Now, I did a video the other week where I was photographing a distillery, and I did just that. I used my spot meter and I metered the grass that was lit up with the same light which was in front of that distillery, and that's how I did that meter reading. So yes, I use spot meters for things that are a long way away. But what if you don't have a spot meter? Many of us don't. I haven't always had a spot meter. Well, in that case, you can still do an instant light meter reading, but make sure two things. One, the meter is in the same lighting as your subject in the distance. And 2, point it toward the camera or in parallel, as though you're pointing it toward the camera if it was in front of you. Do you know what I mean? Don't point it towards the subject, point it backward toward the camera in the same light that the distant object is in. The reason why that works is because the light that's hitting the meter and the light that's hitting the distant subject is the same light coming from the sun, which is 93 million miles away. So there's hardly any hardly any difference at all between the amount of light here and the amount of light over there, 300-400 yards away, whatever it is. So that's why it works. Photo by Mike said, I have a dome and a flat diffuser. How do I use the flat diffuser? Okay, so I've got the same thing here. So with this meter, I've got the dome at the moment out. But if I turn this ring, you'll see the dome disappears inside. And that turns it into a flat diffuser. So what's the difference? Well, when the dome is out, it's measuring the light in a 3-dimensional way. So I have a light over there that's pointing towards me to light me up for this video. And if I have the meter like this side of the dome here is picking up that light, but this side is in shadow. And what it's doing is it's very clever. It's doing a 3-dimensional meter reading. It's measuring some of that light that's directly towards this side, and it's got the shadow on this side. So it actually calculates what the correct exposure is if I had the camera over here pointing towards it, you see. Very clever. So what is with the flat diffuser thing? Well, that is for 2-dimensional light. And when you use that is if, for instance, you have a painting and you're wanting to take a photograph of the painting. Well, the painting is flat, it's 2-dimensional, and so you just point the meter straight out from the painting to get exactly the amount of light that's hitting the painting. It doesn't need 3-dimensional because there's no 3 dimensions to the painting like there is to my face. Does that make sense? So flat for 2-dimensional. Copy work, if you're doing taking photographs of copy of something, or paintings, anything like that, you use it flat. I think in the studio some people might use it to get very directional meter readings of lights that are pointing towards their subject from around the studio. They can point it flat towards that light and get exactly how much that light is putting onto their subject, and then point it to that light and get exactly only what that light provides, and so on. So there you go. Most of the time, out and about, I've got it out because I'm wanting a 3-dimensional instant light meter reading for real life work. All right, the next video is camera light metering, spot metering. And Michael said, in the beginning, you said green grass is almost in middle grey zone, zone 5. So in this case, can we just take a measurement of the green grass and dial that in to our EV? Now, this particular video, camera light metering spot, that was about, if you remember, cast your minds back, I was in front of the chicken shed and I was taking a photograph of the chicken shed, and I was using my spot meter to measure the shadows and then the mid-tones and then the highlights. I'm working out, first of all, what should be my setting on my camera, and also will they actually fit into the number of zones that the film can record successfully. So, 1. Could I just take a measurement of the green grass and dial it in? Yes, I could have done that. I could have measured the green grass and said, now I've got my zone 5, I can set that on the camera. It's like holding a grey card in front of the scene. I've measured that, I know that's correct, put it in the camera. However, I would not know if my highlights were going off the top of the film and not being recorded correctly. And that's an important part of photography, because with black and white, you want to correctly expose your shadows and develop for your highlights, and that's an important part of black and white photography. You can do an average every time, and sometimes you'll get away with it, but there'll be times you won't. But if you measure your shadows, dial them into zone 3, measure your highlight, and work out if that's within the latitude of the film, you can then develop accordingly. If my highlight was, say, 1 stop above what the film can record, then I would develop it at n-1, with n being the normal development time, minus 1 stop. I would pull the development time about 30% to pull down that highlight that's burning out into the latitude of the film. And I need to do a video on this to explain it in more detail. But basically that's why spot metering is used, is because you really want to know where your shadows are so you can get them correctly placed in your film, in your exposure, and then where you have to develop to get everything right. So I need to cover that in a video, I think. Negative Development asks, another great informative video, John. Quick question. By moving the shadows from zone 5 to zone 3, will this also move the highlights from zone 8 to zone 6? Now, I measured my shadows in the video, and I measured the midtone, and I measured the highlights. And I worked out that they were within the 5 stops that the film could record successfully onto paper in my darkroom. So to put the shadows into zone 3, which is where they belong, detail shadows need to be in zone 3, guys. You take a spot meter reading of the shadow, and then you close down the camera 2 stops from that meter reading. Why do we do that? Because the meter thought those shadows were zone 5. It didn't know they were shadows. Wherever I point my meter, it thinks it's zone 5. If I pointed it at the sun, it thinks it's in zone 5. It's a grey card. Well, we know the sun is not a grey card. And we know the shadows are not a grey card. The shadows should be in zone 3. So I point it at the shadows, I get the meter reading, and because it thinks it's in 5, I have to close down 2 stops to make them 2 stops darker than what the meter thought they should be. Does that make sense? Now, that hasn't changed my highlights at all. Because if I pointed my meter at my highlight and said that highlight should be zone 8, but my meter's telling me it's zone, well, my meter thinks the highlight is zone 5. It doesn't know it's a highlight. I have to open the camera up 3 stops to bring that highlight back to zone 8 where it should be. So you're not changing everything when you're doing this spot metering. You're only changing the thing you're pointing at. And the thing you're pointing at in black and white photography should be the shadows with detail in them. And then you close down 2 stops. You're just placing the shadows in the right place. You're not adjusting anything else at all in the scene. I hope that makes a bit of sense. It's hard to describe. The next video, D76 Type Developer, Part 4, Jeffrey Crawley's FX18. So this D76 series was very successful. We had a lot of views of that series actually, which was interesting for me. I didn't realize how many of you used D76 or were even interested in D76. But of course, it is a popular developer. A lot of people use it. Dave asked, so you wouldn't swap these improved versions of D76 for the real thing, but would you go for a staining developer like PMK or over D76? Well, I'm not going to answer that one now. I'm going to leave that one to the end. So bear with me, because I do have an announcement to make at the end of this. So let's move on to the next video. D76 Part 5, Best Dilutions to Use. Now, I think this one had like 78 comments on it, so a lot of comments on this one. Best dilutions to use. If you remember, D76 can be diluted. You can use it stock, 1+1, right up to 1+3 or beyond. And I tested it at stock, 1+1 and 1+3. I wanted to show something that happens to the developer as it's more and more diluted. Ian watched that video and he said, quite surprised at the difference between all these, John. Would you expect a similar result with D23 at 1+3? Yes, I would, absolutely. D23 acts very similar to D76 in every way. The advantage of D23, of course, much simpler to make. I think it's got slightly finer grain. It's got better compensation. There's a lot of advantages, isn't there, in D23? It's got better compensation. It doesn't run away with the highlights as easily as D76 does. And at 1+3, it's just as sharp. Yes, it becomes an acutance developer at 1+3, just like D76 does. So, you know, if I had the choice between D76 and D23, I'll always go for D23. I just think it, in my opinion, I just think it's a better developer. And you can do everything you can with D76 with D23. And I think Kodak realized that when they released it in the 40s, that it was a better developer, much simpler. Frank said, I'm seeing a lot of photographers pull FP4 by 1/3 of a stop to ISO 100. Any particular reasons for that? Now he's talking about the D76 video here, but it also applies to D23. And if you've watched one of my earlier videos about matching your film to your developer, you'll remember that I showed that when you develop your film, you need to test it to find out what true ISO you're getting from your film with that developer. Every developer is different. So you need to find out if your developer's achieving full box speed, or if it's less than box speed, or sometimes faster than box speed, like some of the FX developers give you an improvement on box speed. Diafin gives you an improvement on box speed as well. ID68. So yes, you'll see people pull in their film 1/3 as a stop, half a stop, a whole stop, and that's because they're not achieving their full film speed and they're losing shadow detail. And what's happening is they're taking their photograph and their shadows are blocking up. They're blocking up because the film is not achieving its film speed in that developer. So you need to do the tests to get your film speed right. The third question about this that I want to talk about is, and I didn't write the person's name down for this, so I apologize. As I'm about to try and find my personal film speed for HP5, would you suggest 1+3 as a developer? I seem to remember that compensating developers were not recommended for the zone system. This is true. Compensating developers were not recommended for the zone system. And a lot of it depends on how much compensation they're giving. You could use D76 1+3 as a zone system development technique, but when you start to get N+1 and N+2, you're going to be going to very long development times indeed, because it's already a long development time. So many people don't use such a dilute developer. They would use a stronger developer, a stock solution, for instance, or maybe 1+1, in order that they can keep their development times reasonably short. Now, there's a rule of thumb, which I've covered earlier, actually, I mentioned it earlier in this video, that if you want N+1, you can multiply your development time by 1.4. And that is a rule of thumb that I read in Gene Nocom's book, a very good book that he brought out on photographic development and print development. And he talked about this quite a lot. it's specific towards methyl-based developers, but it does work for others too because I've tried it. So it's a very general idea, but if you have no timings designed, if you haven't experimented and worked out your n plus and n minus timings, use the 1.4 rule. It's roughly 30%. For n plus 1, that means pushing your highest zone, up a stop. It's add 30% to your development time. To add another zone, to push it another stop higher, add another 30% to the new time. So if it was 10 minutes, for one stop, n plus 1, I'd do 13 minutes development. And if I needed to push that zone up another stop, I would add 30% to 13 minutes and develop it for that length of time. So that's a general rule, and it goes the other way as well. 30% less for n minus 1 and another 30% for another n minus 1. And you can't go below 50% of the development time, because if you go below 50%, if you pull your development time below 50% of the normal development time, you'll lose shadows because they haven't completed development until 50% of the time for that film. Okay, so that was a long explanation. I hope you hung in there. Christopher, it almost looks like 1+3 lost half a stop in the shadows. Christopher, you're absolutely right. When you dilute a developer, you can lose a bit of film speed. It goes both ways, which is very interesting. And this brings me toward my announcement. But if you're using stand development or some form of stand, semi-stand, stand, extreme minimal agitation, you actually improve your film speed because the shadows can develop a little more and a little more because it's in the developer for so long with stand development. And remember, film speed is all about shadows, right? The faster your film speed, the better your shadows come up, the more shadow detail you have. But in a developer like D76 or D23, Oneplus 3, it's not in there that length of time like stand development. So it doesn't do the same effect, and you can lose some speed of the film. So you have to do your tests. I say this again and again. You've got to do your personal film speed tests. You've got to do your personal development time tests. And I've got videos to show you how to do that. And it's very easy. I know it's a pain, and I know it's time consuming. And it's the last thing you want to do when you want to be out there taking photographs. And I'm just the same as you. I want to be out taking photographs. But you have to do your tests, because then when you place a zone with your spot meter in a zone, you know it's going to be there. It's not going to be somewhere else where you didn't expect, because you've done your tests and you've put it there and it's going to be there. That's how to make great negatives. John asked, same video. What video are we talking about? Oh, I've lost my place. D76, part 5, best dilutions. All right, the best dilutions. John said, do I use 1+3 as a one shot? Yes, you do. You can't reuse that developer. It's too dilute to reuse in another film. That's the problem. Stock developers have a lot of energy in them, a lot of developing agents, and they will keep going, so you can reuse them. And often it's just adding 10% to the development time. So if I had a litre of D76, I could use it on a film and put it back into that 1 litre bottle, and then use it on the next film and add 10% to my development time, and it would be pretty much the same. It's not exact, but it's very close. And then for the next film, another 10%. And I can't remember how many films you can do that for off the top of my head, but it's several films you can continue to develop in the same 1 litre stock solution and just add 10% for each one. I might do a video on that sometime, actually. It'd be a very interesting one to do. But when you dilute the developer, from 1+1 onwards, when you dilute that developer, no, don't use it again. Throw it away after each use, because it hasn't got the energy to safely develop another film for the right length of time. you'd never know how long you should develop it for to get the right contrast in your negatives. So, unfortunately, one shot. And this brings me 45 minutes. Wow, it's about the same length as the last Q&A. It brings me to that question again, which I skipped over because I want to talk about what's coming up. So D76 Type Development, this question is about Jeffrey Crawley's FX18. Dave asked, so you wouldn't swap these improved versions of D76 for the real thing? And if you remember, I tested D76 against MQ Borox, ID68, Crawley's FX18, and I always said, you know what, if I use D76 I wouldn't swap it out for these because it's so good, it's so it's a lovely developer, so I wouldn't have swapped them out. But Dave asks, would you go for a staining developer like PMK PyroCat over D76? Yeah, I would. Because they bring so much more to the table than D76 does. And when you've used a staining developer, you can see the difference, plain as day. You can see the improvements to your photographs, the improvements to your negatives. They're so much easier to print. They're just better developers. And so for my next videos, I'm going to be talking about a staining developer that I particularly like, PyroCat HD. But I'm going to be talking about a film as well, used with PyroCat HD. And that film is Ilford Pan F. And Ilford Pan F is a tricky film, but a brilliant film. It's a gorgeous film. But it's tricky to get the best of, and that's why many people aren't using it. They're using the easier films to use, like FP4. But PanF has so much that it brings to the table that I wanted to cover that with you guys. And so, in my next videos, I'm going to be talking about getting the best out of Ilford Pan F.